Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the launch of Crisis Group's new early warning platform, the Early Action and Risk Tracking Hub, eEARTH. I'm Alyssa Jobson. I'm Chief of Advocacy at International Crisis Group, and I'm going to be moderating the event today. So after 2 years of development and with soft launches in Nairobi, Brussels, and Washington, DC, today, we're publicly releasing our climate resource and conflict analytics for the Horn of Africa. This has been open since this morning at eEARTH.io. I'd like to thank the donors that have made this possible. International Crisis Group is really deeply grateful for the partnership and support we've received from the Complex Risk Analytics Fund, or CRAFT for short, the Global Challenges Foundation, Stiftung Mercator, and the Government of Liechtenstein. Today, as well as showing you how eEARTH works, we're also going to explore the role of climate and resources in shaping today's conflicts. Following opening remarks from Comfort Ero, who's Crisis Group's President and CEO, Ulrich Eberle, our Project Director for Climate, Environment and Conflict, will introduce us to the eEARTH platform, after which Carolin Graf, Data Analyst, and Chris Newton, our Senior Analyst for Early Warning, will share some of our latest analysis on resources in conflict in Somalia and Yemen. This will be followed by a short discussion with Chris and Sarah Harrison, our Senior Analyst with the US programme, on how climate and resources in conflict context shape policymakers' room for manoeuvre and the decisions that they are able to take. Finally, we'll open up for questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please type it into the Q&A box stating your name and affiliation. And we'll be gathering these throughout the event. Please note that the event is being recorded and live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Comfort to give us an introduction. Thanks, Comfort.
Thanks, Alyssa, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody, wherever you're speaking to. Thank you for joining us today. As Alyssa was saying, as Crisis Group approaches its 30th anniversary, I'm very proud, and along with my colleagues, to be able to launch our eEARTH platform with you all today as well. It's a platform that embodies both the founding principles of Crisis Group, but also how the organization has adapted and evolved over the 3 decades since we began in 1995 as well. For 3 decades, as you all know, those of you who've been supporters of Crisis Group, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for all your support and for your readership of Crisis Group. And for those 3 decades, we've worked to prevent conflicts throughout the world based on trusted political analysis as well. We have earned, thanks to all of you who've been great supporters, but also largely to the confidence built with our analysts in various parts of the world. We've earned access to all sides in a conflict, whether it's rebel commanders to heads of states. And today, we're amplifying that capability, that political analysis, with the new tools for what, frankly speaking, is a new era in the conflict landscape as well. As you all know, we have been witnessing greater sort of geopolitical turmoil. Didn't start this year; it's been long in the game. And at any other time since Crisis Group's founding, the conflict climate, the conflict landscape is radically changing before our eyes as well. One perfect example is the constraints, for example, on the use of force are crumbling as leaders increasingly exploit sort of military and economic power as well. The other big change that we're seeing in the 3 decades that we've been working is that resources continue to become central to how conflicts ignite and spread throughout the world. So, for example, water disputes that once stayed sort of local are now sort of drawing in regional powers. This year, 2025, there's been a lot of talk about critical minerals as though they're a new game in town, but increasingly we're seeing how critical minerals are reshaping alliances, whether it's in Africa, Ukraine, for example, and elsewhere. And climate shocks are creating cascading instabilities that diplomacy itself cannot contain. So whether it's from a village wells, for example, in the Sahel region, to the shipping lanes of the South China Sea, we are seeing how resource dynamics are sort of creating a new grammar for conflicts right across the horizon. And it's very clear to me and my colleagues, led by Ulrich, it's very clear to us that understanding these dynamics, water, critical minerals, climate shocks, understanding these dynamics and why some resource pressures explode into violence while others don't, I think, requires sort of more deeper political knowledge and sort of systematic monitoring, which is why we created this new platform called eEARTH. I think the other glaring fact for me in my time at Crisis Group and over the 3 decades of Crisis Group is that we have invested in regional experts. I certainly started Crisis Group as a regional expert in West Africa, and we all bring irreplaceable trust, access, and political understanding to the work that we're doing. But now we're enhancing our work with more systematic monitoring at scale. Whether it's, we worked for a long time in the Nile Basin region and across the Sahel, and we've often looked at sort of resource competition, resource management as well. And in the last 2 years, trying to build a more systematic monitoring at scale that can give an even more comprehensive picture of what is driving, fueling, and leading to explosion of conflicts throughout many centres as well. One thing that's very clear to us in the analysis that we're looking at is that satellites reveal patterns invisible from the ground, such as creeping land grabs, hidden military buildups, and deteriorating infrastructure. Another good example is that data tracking captures everyday violence that doesn't often make the headlines, but it does signal escalation, like cattle raids, illegal checkpoints, for example, and water point clashes as well. And when governments, for example, and armed groups spread disinformation, as we sort of increasingly witnessed in the last few years, multiple data sources provide verification to help us in our analysis as well. So together with our analysts, people like Sarah, who's on the call with us today, and our data technology, they create something that neither could achieve alone as well. So what we're unveiling today is already sort of an enormous achievement by my colleagues on the call, who will discuss this further with you. A functioning platform that's been tested and refined over the last 2 years. We're very careful about not bringing this out too soon, testing and retesting and making sure that the platform is able to sort of answer those questions that are essential to getting the analysis right and to helping think through how to resolve conflicts as well. But it's also the foundation. The ambition of Crisis Group is that we're creating a platform, a foundation for something greater as well. And that platform, it began as a climate security platform. It was tracking drought, flood, environmental stress also. Climate hazards, for example, remain central to the system that we've been building. But we've also recognized over the last 2 years that the broader potential of the platform is increasingly realizable as well. So since resources are how climate change translates into conflict through water disputes, food crises, and forced displacement, the platform itself is able to track any resource dynamic, not just climate driven ones, which is partly why I'm pretty sort of excited about the expansive nature of the climate as well. We've expanded, for example, from climate to water, food and land conflicts. Now, mineral, energy, and maritime resources are sort of part of our active development as well. And our roadmap extends further still to comprehensive conflict monitoring. And the architecture that we've created is designed to have growth at the core of its evolution as well. So, Ulrich, I've spoken for long enough, and I don't want to steal your thunder because you're the mastermind, so to speak, with the team behind this as well. You've led the beginning of our initiative under my predecessor, Rob Marley, as well. And I should turn it over to you to explain how eEARTH bridges the gap between seeing problems and preventing them, which is the core of Crisis Group's mandate. And after that, I think we'll hear from you and your other colleagues providing sort of real life sort of case studies about where this approach is already making a difference. So, Ulrich, over to you and to your colleagues who have been the real architects of this as well. And I hope our guests don't mind me saying so, but congratulations for also getting us to the moment where we could actually launch the platform. But over to you, Ulrich. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Comfort. Resources, as Comfort just mentioned, are central to conflict. Climate hazards such as drought, floods, extreme heat create resource stress. And that stress can turn violent when the political systems can't manage it. The equation is simple but deadly. More conflict shocks, more resource pressure, more conflict risk. Decision makers are drowning in data they can't interpret. Flood monitors generate thousands of readings, but what water level signals real danger? The raw information exists, but without understanding what combination spells crises, officials can't act. They need someone to translate data into risk to say, this matters, here's why, act now. That is exactly why Crisis Group built eEARTH, the Early Action and Risk Tracking Hub. It's an early warning platform that combines advanced data analytics with Crisis Group's political insight. eEARTH gives near real-time visibility into how climate and resource stresses intersect with conflict dynamics. It's designed for policymakers, humanitarian actors, and practitioners, and turns data overwhelm into actionable insight. So why are we launching eEARTH right now? You already heard that resource pressures are rising fast. At the same time, advances in AI and satellite monitoring allow us now to track these risks more quickly and accurately than ever before. But technology and data alone don't prevent violence. What makes eEARTH distinctive is how it fuses technology with Crisis Group's political expertise drawn from more than 70 conflict contexts worldwide. That is what makes our warnings not just rigorous, but politically meaningful. And now, for the first time publicly, I'm very excited to show you what the eEARTH dashboard looks like, and will walk you through some of its key features. Here you can see Somalia in July 2025, a country where climate pressures and conflict dynamics interact sharply. My colleague Carolin will explain more about that later. On the map, the red dots mark resource-related clashes over land, livestock, and water, while the brown shadings show rainfall anomalies, or areas drier than usual. And this is really just a snapshot of how simple the platform makes it to detect risks effectively. Our map-based design makes it easy to scan a vast number of indicators without needing to dig through dozens of separate platforms. Here on the left, you can see the platform tracks a wide range of signals from climate conditions to displacement and food insecurity. It's all in one place. Then the platform allows you to analyze why these signals matter. On the right, the trend line shows how conflict levels compare to previous years. And just below, the risk table highlights hotspots like Gal Gadud, marked as very high risk for that month. For policymakers, that means spotting the big picture trends and knowing where to focus resources and attention. And for practitioners, it means identifying priority areas for planning, from where to pre-position aid to where to prioritize mediation. Finally, eEARTH helps you to anticipate what comes next. Because data sets refresh regularly and forecasts are built in, the platform doesn't just show you what has already happened, it points to where risks may escalate, whether that's floods fueling new displacement or land disputes triggering violence. That foresight gives governments, agencies, and practitioners a chance to prepare, not just to act. Many great platforms exist that provide super useful insight, but they tend to be fragmented, static, and detached from local politics. eEARTH brings these elements together, offering integrated, regularly updated analysis grounded in political context. And to ensure transparency and accessibility, All the underlying charts on the platform and analytics are freely available for download on our website. And importantly, it doesn't stop at data. When the dashboard flags a key issue, we produce written publications that add political context, helping decision makers to understand not just where a risk is arising, but why they matter and what should be done about it. This dual approach supports both high-level monitoring from monthly foresight and diplomatic engagement and detailed planning down to the district level. Today, we launch eEARTH in the Horn of Africa, where climate and resource pressures are reshaping conflict dynamics. Over the next 18 months, our goal is to scale to global coverage, making eEARTH an essential tool for monitoring and anticipating conflict risks. Next, my colleagues Carolin and Chris will bring the platform to life with case studies from Somalia and Yemen. With that overview, thank you for your attention. Back to you, Alyssa.
Thanks, Ulrich. I think you've really made a compelling case there for why we need to harness new technologies, and especially the value of combining data insights with Crisis Group's traditional research to help policymakers grasp the intricate conflict dynamics. So we're going to look now and see how this plays out in practice in complex settings like Somalia and Yemen. Carolin Graf is going to start with Somalia, which many of you will know is a textbook case of climate insecurity. Last December, Crisis Group released a report showing how Al-Shabaab exploits climate hazards, such as historic droughts, to control water points and coerce local populations. Our data played a key role in mapping climate shocks and land use to reveal these patterns. You'll see now, as Carolin's going to demonstrate, how using eEARTH, we can monitor these patterns over time to provide the latest updates without rewriting full reports, and how these insights can support timely and conflict-sensitive responses from governments and civil society. Thanks, Carolin, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. So with this case study, we'd like to show you how eEARTH allows us to zoom in on very specific and localized conflict dynamics, giving the example of Somalia, where an armed group adapted its strategy as climate conditions changed. So as Ulrich mentioned, we look at historic as well as near real-time data, and this systematic monitoring can really give us a clearer picture of how conflicts evolve. First, let me give you some context around the data insights that I will present in a minute. In Somalia, climate change often has a direct impact on what people need to survive, and therefore climate conditions influence what can be exploited for power. Many Somalis make their living from farming and herding, and so during a drought, water scarcity can become a weapon. So whoever is in control of the little water that is available has a lot of power over affected communities. And when the rains return, land and other resources gain new value, and those productive areas become worth fighting over. So these aren't abstract climate impacts. They are very real resource dynamics that armed groups weaponize. Al-Shabaab understands this well. In times of scarcity, it exerts pressure by destroying or controlling what little exists. And in better times, it can exploit competition over valuable resources. Either way, whether water is scarce or land is recovering and productive, Al-Shabaab has turned both these dynamics into instruments of control and power. But now let's look at eEARTH to see how the data can help us identify such dynamics. We'll start by looking at the 2020 to 2023 period, when the worst drought in decades coincided with the federal government's offensive against Al-Shabaab. The platform shows us a couple things here. So first, of course, the drought shows very clearly, as you can see in the time trend here, large parts of Somalia received barely half their normal rainfall. And as a consequence, vegetation health was well below average as well. Crisis Group has previously reported that at that time, around 40% of Al-Shabaab-controlled land experienced major vegetation loss. In addition, the system identifies dozens of attacks on water infrastructure during the drought period, with a major spike right after the onset of the government offensive, which started in August 2022. So let me now show you what eEARTH shows us about these water-related attacks when we zoom in a little bit more. They cluster in specific areas. As Ulrich mentioned, we developed this risk rating to help identify areas at high risk. You can see that risk rating in the bottom right corner of the slide now. And this risk rating points us toward Gal Gadud, where Al-Shabaab lost considerable territory to the government during the offensive. And the platform pinpoints 8 incidents for September 2022 in Gal Gadud, in which Al-Shabaab intentionally destroyed water sources. The platform also gives us some additional insight on the type of those incidents as well. For example, they were attacks on boreholes or explosives planted on water trucks, including in communities that had joined the government offensive. And let me underline that even though the number of those events might not seem that high, they had outsized effects, because when the only borehole in a village is poisoned or destroyed during a prolonged drought, the consequences can be very severe. So you see the pattern. Al-Shabaab weaponized water during the worst drought in decades by using it as collective punishment against communities that had sided with the federal government during the offensive. Now, let's look at the situation today. You will see how recovery after the drought created different resource dynamics. The drought ended in late 2023, and Al-Shabaab attacks on water infrastructure have virtually disappeared, and instead conflicts over land stands out now. The pattern here is that at least some of the same militias that united against Al-Shabaab during drought now fight each other or step aside for Al-Shabaab. For example, in Gal Gadud, where just this July, militia violence over land killed at least 30 people. That is the big red dot in the central part of the country that you can see on the map now. Other examples would be checkpoints in Hiran or disputes over productive farmland along the Shebele River corridor. So in short, Al-Shabaab strategically adapts to a changing climate. During the drought, the platform shows attacks on water infrastructure. During recovery, those water attacks stopped, and instead we see land conflicts emerge, including between groups that had once been allies. And the result is that Al-Shabaab regains or destabilizes territory where divisions open up. Finally, as we can see on these last slides here, forecasts by ICPAC for the next 3 months show higher than normal temperatures, as well as below average rainfall across much of Somalia, which points to the possibility of localized drought through the end of the year. And if that happens, Al-Shabaab may once again weaponize water by targeting communities aligned with the government or resistant to Al-Shabaab's influence. Through eEARTH, we continue to monitor these developments closely. And of course, everything I've shown today is featured on eEARTH.io. I invite you to explore the site, really dive into the data and see how it can support your own work. Thanks a lot. And with that, back over to you, Alyssa.
Thanks, Carolin. And it's really interesting to see how users of eEARTH might be able to use some of the platform's features in their own programming and as part of the context monitoring toolbox. As Ulrich mentioned earlier, eEARTH's scope will expand over the coming months to include more analytics on agriculture, water, and civilian infrastructure. Our goal is to detect early signs of instability, whether from resource scarcity or perhaps even abundance, before they escalate. In the next case study, Chris will take us across the Red Sea to give us a sneaky peek at what eEARTH will be able to do in the future. Using the case of port destruction in Yemen, he'll show the importance of infrastructure monitoring for preventing and ending conflict, and will also show how eEARTH will help analyze these trends in the future. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. So moving across the Red Sea, I'm going to explore what infrastructure monitoring can reveal about the impact of military campaigns. By looking at ports in Yemen, you'll see how analysis of satellite imagery, which, as we said, we're in the process of integrating into eEARTH, shows the gap between claimed military success and actual outcomes. First, we'll just briefly review the state of play in Yemen and the Red Sea to show why these ports matter. Yemen's civil war has cooled but remains unresolved. Negotiations were an early casualty of the war in Gaza. The Houthis continue to control northwest Yemen and 3 deep-water Red Sea ports, Hodeidah, Salif, and Ras Isa. Most of the country's imports, including food and fuel, would typically flow through these ports, which can also generate substantial customs revenue for the Houthis. Illicit goods, including weapons, as Israel and the US correctly argue, do enter through these ports as well, although the Houthis have been diversifying their supply chains for years. The Houthis continue to attack Israel and commercial shipping in the Red Sea, officially to support Hamas in its war with Israel, although the Houthis are mainly trying to maintain and grow their power within Yemen and the Red Sea. Ships face a choice: pay or otherwise negotiate for safe passage, risk attack, or sail around southern Africa. The US, for its part, seeks Red Sea stability and the elimination of an Iranian-linked threat. Israel, of course, wants Houthi attacks against it to stop. Both the US and Israel have targeted Houthi-controlled ports. The US agreed in May to its own ceasefire with the Houthis, but Washington has continued to pile on economic pressure through sanctions and a total humanitarian funding cut. Now we'll look at what has actually happened to the ports and what the US and Israeli attacks have done to them. Crisis Group analyzed satellite imagery of all 3 ports, the type of infrastructure monitoring that's being built into eEARTH. Early reports concluded that ports were wholly or mostly inoperable, but satellite imagery helps us tell a bit more of a nuanced story. Israel's strikes sought to deter the Houthis through the threatened destruction of the ports rather than by destroying them outright. Discriminate attacks to threaten indiscriminate outcomes. It focused mostly on Hodeidah and Salif ports, incrementally hitting individual berths or places where ships can dock, offloading equipment, and other enabling components over successive strikes. Now, notably, it has not targeted, to date, some key assets like grain silos. So here we see the largest of these 3 ports, Hodeidah, before any strikes. A quick scan, you can sort of tell that there's no real damage here yet, or no damage yet. Now, one of Israel's first attacks gutted Hodeidah's fuel storage capacity. And you can see a series of destroyed fuel tanks where before you could clearly see those white cylindrical objects inside this white oval. Now here we see cumulative damage. This is just from last week, cumulative damage and ongoing activity, and we'll walk through that. Subsequent strikes steadily cratered docks throughout the port, often leaving several berths unusable at a time. 2 large cranes for handling containerized cargo and the track that they ran on were also destroyed. That's that white oval up top, a series of craters, and the track of those cranes could move along before. But ships continue to dock at some of the total 8 berths, including those circled in green. We've seen ships still coming and going despite some of the craters around there. The smaller port of Salif, a major entry point for grain, has a very similar story to Hodeidah, although in the interest of time, we're not going to look at that today. Now, this is Ras Isa before any attacks. It's a port in the sense that it's a place where large ships discharge cargo, in this case fuel, but it's not a port in that it has any sort of specialized infrastructure needed to achieve that offloading. You don't really see much in the way of major infrastructure here besides a very small number of fuel tanks in the top left of the image and some minor piers along the shore. Now, the US demolished the limited onshore fuel storage at Ras Isa and cratered the small piers. In the oval on the left, the destroyed tanks, and the one on the right were those piers. The U.S., after those strikes, or really as those strikes were ongoing, actually declared Ras Issa destroyed back in April, but that is essentially impossible. It would require altering topography more than destroying infrastructure. Water deep enough for tanker ships comes nearly to shore. That's the main asset that this location has. And hoses can be run from ships to trucks. A line of fuel trucks can be seen along the green arrow in the bottom of the image. And you can see the hose coming from that ship or that tanker in the green oval. In some images that we've looked at for Ras Issa, we've seen hundreds of these trucks waiting to be filled at a time. Now we can put all this together and look at what strategically the US and Israel have achieved. After thousands of strikes and billions of dollars spent, the results of their efforts are at best mixed. When it comes to port operations, the Houthis have adapted workarounds despite damage. Hodeidah and Salif are operational with reduced volumes, but at least until recently, comparable offloading rates per ship. Ras Issa is not only functional, but may even be expanding, according to some reports. Port degradation and the wider Israeli and US campaigns haven't restored maritime or Israel security. Red Sea commercial traffic is still very much down, which is easy to tell from the chart here. Bab el-Mandab transits at the southern entry point into the Red Sea versus transits around the Cape of Good Hope at the very southern end of Africa. Undeterred, the Houthis have broadened targeting to nearly 1/5 of the global commercial fleet and continue to attack Israel directly. One of the biggest impacts so far has probably been on food security and the movement of goods within Yemen. Imports are increasingly forced through smaller southern ports like Aden or Mukalla, reducing Houthi customs revenue at their own ports, or their ports they control. These goods are then trucked north into Houthi territory, where costs are added because both southern actors and the Houthis still levy taxes. Now, this shift makes necessities unaffordable in Houthi-controlled Yemen despite strict price controls. A UN-coordinated hunger monitor projects starvation in Houthi-controlled Yemen within the coming months. The net result is greater instability and a high risk of unintended consequences, with neither Yemen nor the Red Sea any closer to peace. So what can we do with this understanding? As with water and land resources in the Somalia case, looking at Yemeni port infrastructure reveals opportunities that aren't visible when military, humanitarian, and maritime monitoring remain in separate silos. The ground truth, ports degraded but functional, humanitarian crisis deepening, strategic objectives unmet, suggest different paths forward depending on your role. Humanitarians may be better able to see through the fog of war and understand the real impacts on commercial and humanitarian logistics, allowing them to better anticipate changes and needs. For policymakers, there are a few possible conclusions here. First, and probably most importantly, punitive or performative military action without a political strategy is not helpful and often counterproductive. The Houthi threat is more likely to be tempered through negotiations, and the Red Sea calmed through regional cooperation, especially among littoral states. Second, the port attacks are creating leverage for southern actors. Displacing imports south gives any group that can establish a checkpoint or even a full land blockade much greater leverage than if Houthi-controlled ports were at full capacity. Third, planning for the day after the Houthis, if that were ever to happen, it means questioning how any regime would be expected to survive without these ports and with unaffordable food and other basic goods. Back to you, Alyssa.
Thanks, Chris, for that really interesting dive into Yemen ports and the dilemmas that they create that are created for policymakers. So through these two case studies, I think we've seen how our analysts are using and plan to use eEARTH to conduct research and also to issue alerts on emerging risks. I'm now going to invite Sarah, our US senior analyst, to join us, and we'll begin to unpack with her and Chris, what this means for policymaking, especially at a time when, as Comfort reminded us earlier, resources are playing an increasingly important role in global politics. And just a reminder that after this exchange, we will be opening the floor up for questions from the audience. So please do put any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and it'd be great if you could state your name and affiliation. So Sarah and Chris, perhaps we can start with you maybe telling us what some of the trends are that you see in international politics and conflict related to natural and other resources. Sarah, can you kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. I can speak from the US perspective. I thought I'd just cover a trend we are seeing, and then a trend we might be seeing. The world is watching the US walk away from multilateral efforts, and in some instances, turning its back on traditional allies to address global problems. And the focus for this administration, the Trump administration, is on a transactional approach to foreign policy, including with respect to mitigating or ending war. And we've seen this in a few contexts already. We've seen the minerals deal with Ukraine and the DRC deal, both of which really hinge on actual progress towards peace. And the shortcomings of this approach, this transactional approach, so far seems to be that U.S. officials won't engage in the details of the implementation of these deals or the progress necessary to move towards peace, which really matters for execution. And they're shedding expertise on these subjects, whether regional or thematic. For example, with the complete ending of USAID, and then also dismantling offices like the Conflict and Stabilization Office at the State Department that had deep expertise on these issues. And so with this, with the US applying this transactional approach to foreign policy, including challenges like intractable conflict, it is really important that others not dismiss the nuance. And this is where I understand eEARTH can play a helpful role by injecting information into other systems for those who need it and value the contributions that this platform provides, including Europeans, or, for example, from the case studies today, the Gulf states. And then a trend that we might see increasing that is a bit concerning as it relates to resources and Chris's helpful case study in Yemen. So we know the US struck this oil port, which for Rasista specifically, there were reports that more than 70 civilians were killed in that strike. And the point of the strike was to cut off fuel supplies and revenue for the Houthis. Such a strike can be or is considered controversial under the law of war, but the US considers or takes the position that it can lawfully strike these war-sustaining objects or revenue-generating objects that are inherently civilian. They're economic objects, and the example provided in the DoD Law of War Manual that describes how these objects are lawfully targeted includes oil exports. This is also reflected in CENTCOM's press release about the attack on this particular port, that it considers it to be this war-sustaining object. This is problematic because it makes a proportionality assessment very complex, because typically civilians are the ones who are operating these facilities, not combatants, and then there are secondary effects on civilians when you target economic objects like this. And so it really challenges the bedrock of the law of war, of international humanitarian law, which is really established to protect civilians. And ICRC, the ICRC and other states take a different view on the law of war and say that these are not lawful targets, and they have to directly support military operations. And so you have these strikes that we're seeing under the Trump administration that we saw under previous administrations as well. But how might we see this kind of very controversial strike used in other contexts against resources like oil exports? We know that the US is threatening to strike drug cartels in Latin America, and they recently did carry out an extrajudicial killing of alleged criminals on the high seas. And so it is possible that we could see the US taking the position that they can strike economic targets that it considers war sustaining, and it could try to target the economic engines of gangs or states that support them. So that's something to look out for, just because of the rhetoric we're hearing from the Trump administration, and it's a concerning trend that we should all be watching, and eEARTH can help flesh that out if those kinds of targets occur. I'll stop there. Turn it over to Chris.
Sarah, Chris, yeah, I mean, interesting to hear your thoughts on how policy and action under the current US government is having an impact. What trends we're seeing there. Chris, is there any sort of broader trends that you've been noticing?
Yeah, well, I'll pick up or I guess two things I could say, and one just to piggyback on what Sarah had said, and then another that's much broader. When we look at that increasingly transactional approach, I think it's also coming and will come to a greater degree with basic resource transfers like foreign aid. Back in February, right at the start of the Trump administration, they told the World Food Programme's executive board the United States is no longer going to dole out money with no return for the American people, which I think was an interesting comment for two reasons, and it kind of got lost in the wider gutting of AID. One, that U.S. foreign aid, including humanitarian funding, has never had a return for the American people, but two, that it's a statement that there's an intent to, or leaving an opening to continue providing foreign aid in some form, even that might get the label humanitarian. And I guess what it shows, and what we've started to see a bit going forward, what I think will continue, is that continued U.S. assistance, even if it's labeled humanitarian, might come at a pretty high cost to states in extreme distress. There might be some pretty heavy concessions demanded or required if those funds are going to turn back on or keep flowing in the few cases where they're still going. And it might involve some organizations that do not in any way operate under the longstanding principles of this post-Cold War global humanitarian system that we've all gotten familiar with. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, with its U.S. funding recently, is maybe a case in point there. More broadly, I think we also see a lot of attritional wars, or wars becoming attritional, that increasingly feature the weaponization of resources, and especially the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And it's a really diverse set of actors that's doing this. It's everyone from the state of Israel in Gaza, facing off with Hamas and its tunnel network, out to an Al-Qaeda franchise in the Sahel. We see the sieges, we see the targeting of food systems. And alongside this massive global contraction in humanitarian funding, that makes this both easier to achieve. Someone's not throwing out assistance that undoes your attempted weaponization of starvation, and also this huge decline in related data and monitoring systems that make the weaponization of resources, or the use of starvation as a weapon of war, a lot easier to hide. It's happened in the past, and it may happen again. Pretty large famines before the 2000s happened and ended without the world really catching on while they were underway. I guess and maybe linking back to what Sarah said, how that strike on Ras Issa, the exact language used, they were hitting it because it was an economic source of power for a designated terrorist group, related to the weaponization of starvation. That does concern me a lot. As Sarah said, the U.S. designation of terrorist groups is pretty rapidly expanding, including for, say, gangs in Haiti, cartels, different parts of Latin America. Gangs in Haiti have seized the country's main oil terminal before, in a very similar way to Ras Issa under the Houthis for Yemen. So it's pretty concerning that the U.S., at least rhetorically, that something that important to civilian survival and the general operation of society could fall under the scope of that thinking. It just looks like states are increasingly interested in what they can extract from a conflict much more than what they can put into one to alleviate suffering.
Thanks, Chris. Sarah, in light of some of these challenges, how do you see eEARTH's insights and the tool more broadly feeding into some of the policy recommendations that you've been making to policymakers in the US and beyond?
Yes, thank you. 2 years ago, Crisis Group published what I think is an evergreen report It's called Out of the Box: How to Rebalance U.S. Somalia Policy. This policy, the U.S. policy towards Somalia, has really been on a glide path for decades, with the U.S. approach being very much focused on counterterrorism and a containment strategy. So it's really about containing Shabab within Somalia, and protecting U.S. interests in the region and U.S. partners in the region. And we think at Crisis Group, based on a lot of research that we did on this policy, is that it's very much unlikely to produce any enduring results, and kind of, move the country towards some kind of peaceful solution. And because it ignores the internal politics in Somalia. And we urge something different to the Biden administration that I think is still relevant today. We recommended U.S. assistance and U.S. focus on reconciliation. And so we talked about this at all levels of Somali society. And in particular, we urged reconciliation support in areas where al-Shabaab had recently been pushed out. So I'm talking about the areas which Carolin described in her case study in 2022. And the reason we said this, and the reason we gave very detailed descriptions about the things that the quick impact projects that the US could be doing, such as repairing boreholes and facilitating service delivery, is because our excellent senior analyst on Somalia, Omar Mahmoud, who's in our Africa program, he's very well aware through all of his research on the ground of how fragile these communities are after al-Shabaab leaves, and how easily al-Shabaab can come back. And so there was all this territory gained. And so we were urging for efforts on reconciliation to help the local clan dynamics move forward in a unified way. Because if there's not a unified front against al-Shabaab, they can easily come back in. And the eEARTH tool helps illustrate those dynamics. And to ignore those dynamics is, I think, a detriment to US policy and to all other states who have invested for many years in Somalia. And so this, I think, plays an important role in some of the policymaking we've made before, and policymaking recommendations we will make in the future to states involved in conflict around the world. And I think eEARTH, the case study on Somalia, also demonstrates how NGOs and others can get really granular information that can be helpful in urging policy changes with states like the United States, who have been involved in conflicts like in Somalia for a very long time. So that's one way in which I think we can put these two great tools together.
Chris, just a really quick question before we switch to the Q&A. We often hear that policymakers and practitioners, that the problem isn't that there's a lack of data. Often they've got a lot, maybe even too much. But the question is more how the difficulty of using that data and connecting early warning to early action. Could you speak to a little bit about that, and then we'll move to the questions from the audience? Thanks.
Sure. Maybe two quick points, quicker than my last 2 points. We definitely see that problem of data abundance and then a scarcity of analysis. And it can be hugely challenging to something like humanitarian anticipatory action, where you have a large number of outputs all focused on a particular issue for many different systems. And it's something we saw in the Horn of Africa drought crisis in the last few years, the time period around that Somalia case study. So it's one of the main things we're trying to overcome with eEARTH. Joining up these different strands of analysis, doing that integration, which can be very difficult if you're an end user, and hopefully giving something more actionable. And then just, I guess I'd also push back a little on the thinking behind that question. I think that's a really familiar problem of the last even couple of decades, but it might not be the main problem we have, certainly in the next 4 years. The world got really heavily dependent on US generated data and expertise. And a lot of that has already been cut or has been proposed for additional cuts. And maybe just one example there, the US is cutting its information systems or halting maintenance on them to such an extent, and other countries are so reliant on that it's to the point where an incredibly close US security ally, Australia, is now looking at severe challenges to its day-to-day weather forecasting. which is a pretty remarkable turn. So I guess the point there is early warning systems, they'll have to increasingly make use of diverse and unconventional and patchy data. And that's something I think eEARTH is well positioned to do.
Yes. So I'm going to turn to the audience questions now. Do keep them coming in. First of all, we've got Noah Tuzolana, and apologies if I don't pronounce your names correctly. I'll do my best. Noah says that he wanted to ask to what extent biases or politically motivated factors are included when using data for forecasting. Taking into account satellite images, for example, are there any background checks for data which is used for the analysis? Ulrich, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question. The short answer is, no data model is perfect, but some are really useful if they're used with care. We are looking at satellite information, which is very useful, especially in areas where access is an issue. But still, we need to understand whether what we see from space is actually reflecting the situation on the ground. There's certainly limitations to it. The way we approach this before we launch a country is that we have a launch protocol where we benchmark and validate some of the data and talk to our analysts and have a conversation of whether the data checks out. We can't do this in every single village, but we definitely able to spot bigger biases that way. So that's the first part. The second part is that sometimes it's really just that you can't, remove all potential biases, but you can help the user to understand what they see by explaining to them how to handle data. So on the website, when you are looking at the country like Somalia, there is a little section called Important Considerations that outlines these limitations in the data. And it's really meant to guide users. And we put a lot of thought into that to ensure that people can use data that is complex and needs a lot of background to really fully capture all the details, but you can also use it in a responsible way by following a couple of guidelines. Last point I want to make here is that it does happen that certain data sources do not meet our quality bar. And in those cases, we don't publish. And again, that is, we want to be upfront about it. We want to be realistic, what is useful, what is not. And then also bring in political analysis and our insight from the ground to ensure that we have some ground validation and also to ensure that we have more contextual insight in addition to what we see in satellite data, for example.
Thanks, Ulrich. We've got a question from Lise Tagziria. She's the senior analyst for West Africa at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And just to remind the audience, if you do want to ask a question, it's great if you can give us your affiliation as well as your name, like Lee has done. So Lise asks, could you please speak to the ways in which this tool supplements the raw quantitative data with crisis group's regional expertise? And then a second question, much more practical, will future development allow users to visualize data for more than one country at the same time? For example, all the Sahelian states.
Wonderful. I take that one if that's okay.
Yeah.
It's a good question, and you essentially point out some of the future extensions of the system. Perhaps first to your first question. So the way it works is that, and I pointed that out in my remarks as well, that the data will help us to flag issues that Chris, for example, investigates them further together with Carolin. That's sort of the workflow. But you're right. Right now, we have these country-specific views. That was really for us a priority to get that right and have all the information available monthly and at the subnational level. So usually that's the district level. That's really the foundation of everything else we do in the future. And one of the things that we are planning to do is to also take a regional perspective to identify priorities within a region, but still have these micro foundations baked in the data. So you're absolutely right. This is part of the global expansion of eEARTH will also include to look at larger regions and to scan to make it easy for users and for our audience to identify if there is any uptake in resource-related conflict in some parts. So it's easy for the user to, see that at a glance, but also have the ability to really dive into the data and unpack that at the district level.
Thanks, Ulrich. Next question we've got is from Seb Kratzer, who is Environment, Climate and Peacemaking Advisor at HD. Seb says, hi and well done, great tool. Thanks, Seb. We think it is, and glad to hear that you do too. What will be the coverage of the tool? Maybe more interestingly, do you feel already see the recommendations that Crisis Group is developing looking differently based on cross-sectoral and data-driven analysis? Ulrich, I'll open to you, but if Chris wants to come in, or maybe even Sarah.
Yeah, definitely. I think one important aspect, and I think Comfort pointed that out nicely, is that we started looking, at the local context, for example, the floods impact on displacement in South Sudan. And we're still, having that sort of granularity in our work, but we are more and more looking at the systemic level. And there was also one question on whether we look at energy. And it's totally true that, we need to see the bigger picture, need to be able to talk about that. And I think, the way how Chris interacts with the data and brings in the political piece is really key here to get it right. Energy is one area, water systems is another one we are working on. Comfort also mentioned a couple of things related to trade, such as maritime security. You could see that the approach that we're having, these satellite fused with political insights, would be quite helpful here. But over to you, Chris, sharing your thoughts on this as well. Oh, Sarah.
Sure, maybe I'll go.
Oh. Go ahead, Chris.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, in terms of recommendations, I think it's still early days for say new policy lines or big adjustments, as Sarah pointed out. I think some of the initial work when we were testing out the system, we found to be not to congratulate ourselves, but I mean, for the Somalia report, which was a few years ago, hugely supportive of some of that thinking, and kind of helping flesh out even more the importance of some of those recommendations. Maybe similar for Yemen, the quick look at ports that I gave sort of strongly reinforces what you would get from our Arabian Peninsula and Yemen colleagues on how this is really about negotiations, and pressure campaigns have a long history of not working so well there. But also, I think we're starting to maybe more deeply cover some issues that Crisis Group has touched on in the past, and then I think we've got a lot of potential for developing some new or different lines there as well.
Thanks, Chris. Sarah, did you want to come in? No. Okay, great. So we've got a question from Batsaber Seifu from Gem Tigray, a movement for social, economic and political empowerment of women and girls in Tigray. And she brings up an interesting question, which is how will eEARTH ensure that in regions like Tigray, the gendered risks women and girls face from climate stresses and resource scarcity are captured early enough to guide targeted humanitarian response? And similarly, we've got a question from Mitra Jalali, who says, wants to know about minority groups and how those groups, issues affecting those groups can be sort of shown in are there considerations within the platform. So I think those two questions have a similar theme. So Ulrich, over to you on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, and super important question. It is an area where we are still not where we want to be. Particularly when it comes to satellite-based analysis, it's really, really hard to just base telling on that. If there is, for example, gender violence or minority groups are affected, it's really, really difficult still. I think there is two answers to get us to where we want to be. Number one is that there are more and more data initiatives that help us understand these insights. For example, Graf, one of our partners, launched a specific call for applications on that. So we are really looking forward to see that kind of information that has that level of detail. The other part is that data won't tell us all. It might show us, where is something happening that is relevant, but really unpacking the situation on the ground that will still continue to happen through our written analysis. And that's also where we can talk to communities. To give you an example, when we worked on South Sudan on the floods and displacement 2 or 3 years ago. What we did is we interviewed displaced herder communities, and we also looked at the data, and really these pieces coming together gave us a more comprehensive picture, but certain aspects will always and need to become from the field on the political side, but also on specific communities affected. So we'll continue with that dual approach. We think that is a strength that we are able to write reports on and cover the way we have been doing it for a long time really well.
Thanks, Ulrich. Got a question from Peter Marsden. He says, this is a great resource and many thanks for illustrating it. Wants to know, are you open to colleagues from other organizations feeding data into the analysis, including conflict political data? And if so, how do we do it? That's again from Peter Marsden, and he's from Concordis International. So are we open to partnering?
Absolutely, and I think the launch is really a starting point for many collaborations. That's exactly the role we think we have, that we can, provide some sort of clearinghouse for data as well, that we work with partners together who do amazing work. As you can see, all the data is from third parties. There's a lot of people that do amazing work, and we are very grateful for all the partnerships we already have. Carolin, if you want to come in here as well, feel free to. But really, please reach out. Our job, I think, is to build it into a system to make it accessible. We already invested a lot in infrastructure and in an approach that I think works. And there's no need to replicate this in 10 different platforms. We will be happy to have this conversation. But yeah, Carolin, I don't know if your thoughts, you're leading our partnership, so feel free to come in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Ulrich said, we're using third source data sources throughout. And yeah, maybe just a couple of general points, what we are looking for in the data sets that we're using. We're trying to always find data sets that are of global coverage, just to make sure that we can, that scalability is feasible, and we have these automated data pipelines. So we can use the same data for various countries. Also, as you know, we update frequently. So for now, we use data sets that are updated at least once a month, and also go to the subnational level. So that allows us to zoom in. But yeah, totally agree with Ulrich. Always open for that.
Thanks. Next, got a question from Daniel Manyasi, who's from the Single Mothers Association of Kenya in Nairobi. And Daniel wants to know, can the mechanism be used for CWARN, which is the African Continental Early Warning System, on conflict hotspots, demographics, and cross-border movements? He's thinking of the integration of refugees with local communities and sympathizers joining Al-Shabaab, which is a case in Kenya. We've had a couple of other questions as well, sort of specifically thinking about refugees and population flows and how those can be illustrated within the platform.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We do have a partnership with IGPAC, who is eEARTH's early warning arm, and they're related to CWARN. So we have conversations with them. Also to note, we had these prototype launch events last year. One of them was in Nairobi. So there's CWARN is among our friends. We also conducted needs assessments for Somalia and South Sudan, but we talked with stakeholders in the region and those countries to better understand where the data gaps are, what the needs really are. That was for us important to design a product that people want to use. There's nothing worse than designing a really good product that will not be used. So I'm glad you're raising the point on CWARN. We'll definitely engage with them again now that we have the product launched. And also just to note that now it's online, we are much more able to test now specific new user features. So there's a lot in the pipeline. We'll announce some of that soon. You already heard some of it. And now it's really the time, if you're interested or have ideas, to reach out to us. We're really, really keen to hear your feedback, your ideas.
Thanks. Got a question from Simon Ilse from the Global Unit for Human Security at the Heinrich Boll Foundation. He said to be interested in the preventative capability of eEARTH. How will that ideally play out in your plans? So far, the examples were mostly reactive, as in understanding global patterns of conflict and analyzing attacks. We've also got a second question along those veins from Ali Hassan at Somalia Met, which says, yeah, how can we turn this early warning into early actions, especially in Somalia?
Very good. Perhaps I give the answer to the first part, and then Chris could come in, who's our early warning specialist. I think in the design of eEARTH, there were 2 points that were very important to us, and they came out of these assessments that I just mentioned. One was comprehensiveness. The other one was ease of use. Comprehensiveness is that we cover certain things that people care about. For example, conflict, climate, humanitarian impact data. And then ease of use is what I showcased earlier, that it's intuitive to use eEARTH, but also that we update regularly. Right now it's monthly for most data sets. We want to go to daily. That's at least our vision. And that will obviously allow more applications, particularly for those operating on a short timeline. When it comes to anticipatory action, and Chris can come in, but for now, our focus was not on conflict prediction, but rather on related forecasted data, such as seasonal rainfall and temperature forecast. For the Horn of Africa, they are widely used, for example, by FuseNet, to make assumptions about projected food insecurity, and using that to assess potential scenario outcomes in the next couple months. But Chris, feel free to come in here as well. You're the specialist on early warning.
Sure. I mean, maybe just a quick point. So we have time for other questions on linking early warning to early action. I mean, as Ulrich has said, our first objective here is getting the early warning part right, and building out a lot of the things that Ulrich has outlined, and that's really what the project is looking to bring its analysis. I mean, the link to early action is partly the advocacy that could be done based on what comes out of eEARTH and from the rest of Crisis Group, from end users of eEARTH. But I think fundamentally it's still going to be the political actors themselves, as it would be with any other advocacy. It's the hope here and the thinking here is that were we to have this improved analysis, this stronger evidence base, that it would be a useful tool in helping people come to those decisions and creating that link from early warning to early action. But I mean, I think we all know evidence analysis is certainly no guarantee of that political action.
Thanks, Chris. Got a question from Adam Yazal at the American University. Wants to know, what are some of the specific strategies eEARTH can use to navigate the breakdown of monitoring systems? I presume here he's talking specifically about FuseNet, but we may see degradations elsewhere. So yeah, what are some of the specific strategies eEARTH can use to navigate the breakdown of monitoring systems and increasingly limited data while maintaining statistical power? What are the risks of inference to supplement gaps in data?
Yeah, it's an important challenge that we are all facing these days. I think that's was also why eEARTH is part of the answer for us, is to provide independent information, and having it housed at Crisis Group, independent organization that is able to do that because it's a priority for us. When it comes to the underlying data, we have diversified quite a bit, and we build in redundancies where necessary, just to be ready in case certain satellite systems won't be public anymore. We don't have any strong indication yet, but there's certainly some potential risks there. We use quite a bit of the European Space Agency's data, for example, but we also have a partnership with Planet Labs, for example, is a private data provider. So there's ways to work around that. And I think also deeply embedded in the eEARTH methodology is that satellite is the scaffolding and other information is built around it. You're building in redundancies that way. You're collecting evidence on specific locations that way. And that also gives you a bit more leeway to not fully rely just on one data. And that will be a lot of the future proofing of eEARTH as well, to build in that robustness more and more over the next 12 to 18 months.
Thanks. Question from Danae Smith, who's a doctoral researcher at Aalto University. So you mentioned you incorporated certain risk indicators into the data model. Could you speak a bit more on what shape these risk indicators and parameters for the data are? The context and conflict sensitive indicators that are embedded into the data model? Maybe, or you can start, but maybe it's a question for Carolin as well.
Yes, great question. I think if we want to go into detail, will be another conversation. But some key variables, they have this risk rating. It's meant to help flag risks pretty effectively. And it's also part of the validation exercise. So, for example, we have one for floods, and we compared that to flood events in South Sudan, and we're checking how well it's performing. So there isn't really a guide, how to do guide but there are other partners and others that have done similar type of approaches. So it's really built on a lot of knowledge in this space already. But Carolin, perhaps you have some additional thoughts here.
Sure, yeah, maybe without going into too much detail, but just giving you a broad overview of the indicators that we do consider in this risk rating. So generally speaking, we, like, on the one hand, we use absolute numbers, for example, the number of conflict events, because a high number of conflict events will always matter and always should be considered in a risk rating. But on the other hand, we also use relative indicators as well. So for example, if in a given state, there's usually not that much conflict happening, but now there's more, and on an absolute level, it's not that much, but it's for that particular states, it's very high, then that should also be considered, which is why we also incorporate those relative indicators. We also look at seasonality, for example, because some months are typically more calm, and yeah, so there we would just integrate the deviation from the seasonal mean, for example. But yeah, I'll leave it there. If you have additional questions, just send us an email. We're always very happy to discuss this.
Okay, I'm going to have one last question from Geneviève Renard. She's Senior Advisor Strategic Communications at University Mohammed VI of Morocco, also previously a crisis group colleague. Hi, Geneviève. She wants to know, how will we measure the impact of the tool? Ulrich, for you, I think.
Yeah, thank you. There is several ways to do that. One is just by how often it's used. That's usually a pretty bad indicator. We are working now towards what I would call innovation accounting, to see which features really work. And then I think there is also a bigger question of, if in specific context it has been used and made a difference. And that's more going towards causality. We're talking with a couple of partners about potentially assessing eEARTH that way. Also, we talk with other partners as we are doing more and more scenario planning on this, or scenario development, to address the performance. We want to be really transparent about that. I think you can only improve if you know when you get something wrong, and for what reason you got it wrong. And so we're trying to be very transparent around that. If you have ideas on how to assess that or to measure it, we are very keen to explore that. Now that we are live, we can do definitely more than we could do in the past. So we are, as I mentioned, please reach out if you have ideas. But there's still a lot ahead of us when it comes to that. There are certain things we can do simply on performance and what people are using, but then if it really made a difference on the ground, that's when we need to be a bit more technical. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Ulrich. And sorry to say that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Comfort, Ulrich, Carolin, Chris, and Sarah. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us, and apologies that we haven't been able to address all of the questions that were submitted. If you do have a burning question, then do reach out to the eEARTH team. I'm sure they will be keen to answer. And as we said, we're looking for partnerships, so engagement, we're really keen on that. And we'd invite you as the audience to explore eEARTH.io. You can also scan a QR code which is on the screen now, and do subscribe to the eEARTH newsletter for updates on publications and events. One last thing from me, just to let you know that the event recording will be available soon on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, or if you've got colleagues who missed it, do direct them to our YouTube channel. You can also find it on our website at www.crisisgroup.org/events-recordings. Thanks again, everyone. And I hope that, well, it was glad to see the response from the audience and that you're as excited about this new tool as we are. Thanks.